The message came at 0300 hours, Earth Standard Time. It was not a polite message. It was not wrapped in diplomatic language or softened with the kind of careful phrasing that species used when they were still figuring each other out. It was blunt, it was cold, and it was delivered on every broadcast frequency humanity had ever registered with the Galactic Communications Council. Attention, species designated human. The sovereign galactic empire hereby declares a state of total war against your civilization. You have 72 hours to submit unconditional surrender or face complete and total annihilation. This is not a negotiation. This is not a warning. This is a declaration. The empire does not repeat itself. The message was signed by Emperor Veth Coral III, ruler of 47 star systems, commander of 12,000 warships, and the single most powerful individual in the known galaxy. His fleet was already moving. 1,700 ships had broken from their positions along the outer rim and were pushing hard toward the Sol system at maximum jump speed. By every calculation the Empire's War Council had run, humanity would be on its knees within a week. They had not consulted humanity on that timeline. On Earth, the message landed in the middle of the night for most of the planet. Automated systems flagged it, translated it, and routed it to every government, military command, and intelligence agency on the planet within 40 seconds. People were woken up. Lights came on in presidential palaces and military bunkers. Generals got dressed. Ministers called their advisors. And somewhere in a secure facility outside Geneva, the Secretary General of the United Earth Council sat down in front of a mug of terrible coffee and read the declaration 3 times. Then she asked her aide to get her the Joint Military Command on the line. Then she finished her coffee. What the Empire did not know, what no outside species had ever really taken the time to understand, was that humanity had been quietly preparing for something like this for a long time. Not because humans were paranoid, though many of them were. Not because they expected war, though they always planned for it. But because humans had a particular relationship with conflict that was different from almost every other species in the galaxy. Most civilizations, when they reached a certain level of development, moved away from war. They found it inefficient, costly, wasteful of resources and lives. They built systems of deterrence and diplomacy and slowly let their militaries shrink into ceremonial roles. Humanity had done none of those things. Humanity had looked at the stars and thought, there are things out there we do not understand, and some of them might want to hurt us. So let us be ready. It was not aggression. It was not warmongering. It was something older and deeper than either of those things. It was the instinct of a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and its own wars and come out the other side not softer, but harder, and very, very experienced. The Empire's intelligence files on humanity were embarrassingly thin. They had population numbers, rough estimates of industrial output, and a few intercepted communications that suggested humans were emotionally unstable and prone to irrational behavior under stress. The War Council had taken this as a weakness. They were not the first to make that mistake. What the files did not contain was any accurate accounting of the UEHM, the United Earth Hegemony Military. The UEHM had not advertised itself. It had no flashy parades, no public demonstrations of firepower designed to intimidate neighboring species. It existed quietly, spread across a dozen star systems humanity had colonized over the past 2 centuries, and it had been building and training and refining itself with the kind of patient, grinding focus that humans brought to things they considered important. By the time the Empire's declaration hit the airwaves, the UEHM had 412 active warships. That number sounds small against 1,700. It is small. But those 412 ships had been designed by people who had read every account of every space battle ever recorded in the galactic archives. People who had taken notes on what worked and what did not. People who had then ignored half of the conventional wisdom and gone their own direction, because humans tended to do that. Admiral Yenna Marsh got the call at 0317. She was already awake. She had a habit of sleeping badly before anything important happened, and something had told her, in that wordless animal way, that the night was going to be interesting. She read the declaration on her tablet, set the tablet down, and looked out the window of her quarters at the docking bay below, where 3 of her ships sat in their berths, lit from underneath by the pale blue glow of their drive systems running on standby. She did not feel afraid. She felt something else. Something she recognized from a long time ago, from the first time she had ever walked into a real fight and felt the world slow down around her. It was focus. Clean, cold, total focus. The kind that burns away everything that does not matter and leaves only the problem in front of you. She picked up her tablet again and sent a single message to her command staff. All hands. We're going to work. Across the Sol system and beyond, similar scenes were playing out. Officers being called in. Crews reporting to their ships. Supply lines spinning up. The vast, quiet machine of the UEHM beginning to move in the way that large, well-built machines move when you finally push the right button. Not with noise. Not with scrambling. With the deep, settled momentum of something that has been ready for a long time. The civilian reaction was different, and in some ways more telling. The declaration had gone public within minutes of its broadcast. News networks picked it up instantly. Social media exploded. And the dominant reaction across the human internet was not panic. It was not despair. There was fear, certainly, in the quieter corners of things, in private messages between families separated by light years, in the worried faces of parents looking at their children. Fear is human and honest, and nobody pretended it wasn't there. But the loudest reaction, the one that rose above everything else and set the tone for what followed, was anger. Clean, focused, deeply unimpressed anger. Comment sections filled with people pointing out that the Empire had clearly never looked too hard at human history. Talk shows hosted retired generals who spoke with the calm certainty of people who had been thinking about scenarios like this for decades. A clip went viral of a very old man in a small apartment somewhere in the American Midwest who looked at the camera and said, in a voice that did not shake at all, 72 hours. They gave us 72 hours. Son, we've been ready for 72 years. It got 4 billion views in 6 hours. In the halls of the Empire's War Council, no one was watching human social media. That was, in retrospect, a significant oversight. Not because the memes and the anger and the old man's video were militarily relevant, but because they were a data point. They were a window into the psychological state of the species the Empire was about to go to war with. And if anyone had been paying attention, they might have noticed something important. Humanity was not afraid of the Empire. Humanity was annoyed by it. There is a difference between those two things, and it is a difference that matters enormously in war. A frightened enemy can be broken. An annoyed one. An enemy that looks at your ultimatum and feels not terror but irritation. That enemy does not break the same way. That enemy fights differently. It fights with a particular kind of stubborn, grinding, deeply personal intensity that is very hard to plan against. The Empire's fleet crossed the outer marker of the Sol approach corridor at 1,400 hours, 2 days into the 72-hour window. Their sensors swept the system. They found Earth, they found the colonies, and they found something that made the lead admiral pause for just a moment before he filed it away as irrelevant. The human ships were already in formation. Not scrambling. Not repositioning in a panic. Already in formation, already at battle stations, already waiting. As if they had known exactly where the Empire would approach from and had simply gone ahead and set up accordingly. Which, as it happened, they had. Admiral Marsh's voice came across the command channel, calm and even, carrying that particular quality of someone who has made a decision and is completely at peace with it. She looked at the sensor display showing 1,700 enemy ships bearing down on her position, and she did the thing that human commanders had been doing for as long as there had been human commanders. She leaned forward. All ships, she said. Weapons free. The first hour of the Battle of the Sol approach would later be studied in war colleges across 11 star systems, by students who would spend entire semesters arguing about what exactly had gone wrong for the Empire so fast, and so completely, and in ways that no one had predicted. The Empire's fleet came in expecting a standard engagement. They had numbers. They had firepower. They had a tactical doctrine that had won them 37 wars across 4 centuries, a doctrine built around overwhelming force delivered in coordinated waves, the kind of approach that worked reliably against opponents who fought the way most species fought. Defensively, reactively, trying to hold ground and minimize losses while looking for an opportunity to negotiate. Humanity did not fight that way. The UEHM ships did not hold their line and wait to absorb the opening strike. They moved forward. All of them, the entire human formation, for 112 ships, pushed directly into the incoming fleet at a velocity that the Empire's tactical computers flagged immediately as abnormal. The computers ran the engagement projections and returned a simple output. This behavior is not consistent with a defensive posture. That was because it wasn't a defensive posture. Admiral Marsh had looked at the numbers and made a calculation that would have seemed insane to most commanders in the galaxy. She had 400 ships against 1,700. If she fought defensively, she would lose those ships one by one as the Empire's superior numbers ground her down. The odds in a straight attritional fight were terrible. But attritional fights were not the only kind. Marsh had read a great deal of military history, ancient and modern, human and alien. She had a particular fondness for the accounts of naval warfare in humanity's 19th and 20th centuries, when wooden ships gave way to steel ones and commanders had to rethink everything they knew about how battles worked. What she had taken from all of that reading was a single core principle that she had spent her career building her tactical philosophy around. Speed changes everything. The human ships hit the Empire's leading edge before the Imperial fleet had fully deployed into their engagement formation. The Empire's ships were designed to fight at range, using long-distance energy weapons and coordinated fire patterns that required space and time to set up properly. Marsh had given them neither. Her ships went in fast and close, inside the effective range of the Empire's heaviest weapons, fighting at distances where the human vessel's shorter range but significantly more powerful close combat systems had the advantage. It was, to use a very old human analogy, the difference between a boxer who likes to keep their distance and one who comes straight in and ties you up in the clinch. The long-range fighter has a plan. The plan requires space. Take away the space, and the plan falls apart. The Empire's leading ships took catastrophic damage in the first 11 minutes. 3 Imperial cruisers were destroyed outright. 7 more broke off the engagement line, trailing debris and atmosphere. The human ships were taking damage too, serious damage in some cases, but they kept pushing. They did not pull back to regroup. They did not pause to assess. They went through the gap they had punched in the Imperial formation and kept going, splitting the enemy fleet, turning what had been an organized advance into a confused melee that the Empire's centralized command structure was badly suited to handle. Admiral Voss, commanding the Imperial fleet, was a competent officer with a long record of successful campaigns. He was not, however, accustomed to this. He was accustomed to enemies that behaved in recognizable ways, that made decisions he could map against his experience and respond to with the deep institutional knowledge of the Imperial War Academy. What the humans were doing did not map against anything in that experience. His ships were being engaged in multiple directions simultaneously by an enemy that seemed completely indifferent to the conventional rules of how space battles were conducted. He called for a tactical withdrawal to regroup at 1,500 hours, 47 minutes into the engagement. It took him another 30 minutes to actually complete the withdrawal because every time his ships tried to pull back, the human ships followed them, pressing the engagement, refusing to give the Imperial fleet the breathing room it needed to re-establish formation. By the time the Imperial fleet finally managed to open enough distance to regroup, they had lost 63 ships destroyed and another 41 badly damaged. Humanity had lost 9 ships and had 14 more that needed repair. The numbers were still heavily in the Empire's favor. Voss knew this. His analysts knew this. The War Council back in the Imperial capital knew this, and they sent him a message reminding him of it in terms that were not particularly sympathetic to his situation. He had 3 times the ships the humans had, even accounting for his losses. The logical conclusion was clear. Press the advantage. Force the engagement on Imperial terms. Voss composed his response to the War Council carefully, because he was a professional and he understood chain of command. Then he sent the response that protocol required and began planning his next move. But there was something in him, something that career soldiers sometimes develop when they have seen enough real fighting, that was sending a signal his analytical mind was trying to ignore. Something was wrong. He did not know what yet. The numbers said he should win this. The numbers said the humans had hurt him, but not badly enough to change the fundamental balance of the engagement. The numbers were probably right. But the humans had gotten here before his fleet had fully deployed. They had known the approach vector. They had been waiting in formation. And they had fought in a way that suggested this was not improvisation, not a desperate gamble, but a deliberate plan. Which meant the humans had a plan. and Voss did not know what the rest of it was. He found out 2 hours later. The UHM had not committed everything to the Sol approach. Marsh's 400 ships were the forward element, the fist that hit the Imperial fleet in the face and kept hitting it. While the main engagement was consuming the attention of Voss and his command staff, a second force had been moving on a long flanking arc through the outer system. 80 ships, fast ones, the lightest and quickest vessels in the UHM inventory, running dark and silent, using the gravitational shadow of the outer planets to mask their approach. They came out of nowhere, from the Imperial perspective, emerging from behind the gas giant on the fleet's unprotected flank at 1,700 hours and hitting the Imperial rear element before anyone had time to respond meaningfully. They did not try to destroy the rear element. They were too small a force for that. What they did instead was considerably worse from a tactical standpoint. They went for the command ships. Every navy in history, human and alien alike, had command ships. Ships with better communications equipment, more processing power, the senior officers, and their staffs. Ships that were usually kept back from the worst of the fighting because they were too important to risk. The humans had identified the Imperial command cluster from sensor data during the first engagement, tagged them, and sent the flanking force directly at them with a single mission: cut the head off. Voss's flagship took 3 direct hits before its defensive screens failed. He got his staff to the emergency bridge and kept functioning, but 2 of his 4 fleet commanders were not so fortunate. Their ships were destroyed in the first minutes of the flank attack. The coordinated command structure that the Imperial tactical doctrine depended on fractured. Individual ship captains began making their own decisions, some good, some terrible, none of them coordinated. The Imperial fleet was not broken. It was still enormous and still dangerous, and Voss was still fighting. But it was no longer the smooth, coordinated machine it had been 2 hours ago. It was 1,700 ships with varying damage levels, patchy communications, and a growing unease that was spreading through the fleet in the way that unease does when a battle is not going the way you were told it was going to go. In the human fleet, things were not perfect either. Marsh had lost ships. She had officers and crew who would not come home. The damage reports coming in were serious, and some of her ships were fighting on backup systems and prayers. She was tired in the particular way that combat commanders get tired, the kind of tired that lives in your bones and the back of your eyes. She had been on the bridge for 6 hours. She had a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, and she had not noticed. She looked at the tactical display, read the disposition of the Imperial fleet, and began building the next phase in her head. Because this was not finished, Voss would regroup. He would adapt, at least somewhat, and he would come back. He still had the numbers. But he had come here expecting a species that would flinch. And humanity, as a general principle, did not do that. She picked up the cold coffee, drank it anyway, and started talking to her senior staff about what came next. Around her, on 104 ships still in the fight, her crews were doing the same thing. Patching damage, repositioning, catching 2 minutes of food or rest wherever they could find it, and preparing to go again. Because that was the thing about humans, the thing the Empire's intelligence files had not captured and the War Council had not understood, and Admiral Voss was only now beginning to genuinely grasp. They did not stop. The War Council of the Sovereign Galactic Empire met in emergency session on the 4th day of what they had expected to be a swift and decisive campaign. The chamber was large and cold and very quiet. The kind of quiet that fills a room when everyone present knows that something has gone badly wrong and no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. Emperor Veth Coral III sat at the head of the table and looked at the reports from the Sol system with an expression that his advisors had learned, over the years, to be very careful around. It was not anger. It was something colder than anger. It was the look of a man who had made a decision that he had been completely certain about, and who was now being asked to reckon with the possibility that he had been wrong. The numbers on the table were difficult to argue with. Admiral Voss had regrouped his fleet after the second engagement and repositioned. He still had resources, still had significant firepower, and he had sent back detailed tactical assessments that were thorough and professionally written and fundamentally said the same thing in different ways. The humans are not fighting the way we expected. The War Council had anticipated a short campaign. They had brought supplies and ammunition for 2 weeks. They were on day 4 and had not achieved a single one of their operational objectives. The first Minister of Military Affairs, a tall, narrow alien named Sector Commander Preth, laid out the situation in the careful language of someone choosing every word to minimize personal exposure to blame. The initial engagement had resulted in losses beyond projected parameters. The human fleet had demonstrated unexpected tactical flexibility. The flanking maneuver at the second engagement had disrupted command coordination. These were setbacks, not defeats, and the Empire retained sufficient force to continue the campaign. No one challenged any of this because no one wanted to say what everyone in the room was thinking, which was that humanity had walked into a war with the most powerful military force in the known galaxy, and, for days in, was winning. Not decisively, not in the way that would end things. The Empire still had ships and resources and the capacity to continue. But winning on points, winning in the way that matters over the course of a long campaign, bleeding the Empire's advantages away one engagement at a time, and doing it while taking proportionally far fewer losses. The math, run honestly, and without the kind of motivated reasoning that councils in difficult situations tended to produce, was not encouraging. Emperor Coral asked one question, quietly, looking at the tactical map rather than at any of his advisors. What are the humans doing right now? The intelligence minister pulled up the latest sensor reports from the Sol system. The human fleet was resupplying. Ammunition, fuel, crew rotations. Medical ships moving between the damaged vessels. And the ships that had taken serious damage in the first two engagements were being repaired, at a speed that the intelligence minister found genuinely alarming, using methods that the Empire's engineers had reviewed and could not fully explain, modular repair systems that could replace major components in hours instead of the days it would take in any Imperial shipyard. The humans had designed their ships to be fixed fast. They had anticipated being in a long fight, and they had built their entire military infrastructure around the assumption that they would need to repair and return to action quickly. The Empire built ships to be powerful. The humans had built ships to be durable, maintainable, and fast to bring back online. Two different philosophies. Two different assumptions about what war looked like. The Imperial fleet was also resupplying, but the supply situation was less comfortable. They had not expected to be here this long. The nearest Imperial supply depot was 4 jump points away, which meant resupply runs took time during which the human fleet was getting itself back into fighting shape while the Imperial ships waited. Voss sent another report that arrived during the council session. He had identified a pattern in human tactical behavior that he believed could be exploited. They were aggressive to the point of overextension in the initial phases of each engagement. If the Imperial fleet could absorb the first push and maintain cohesion, they might be able to encircle and destroy a significant portion of the human force in the follow-through. It was a reasonable plan. The council approved it. Voss began setting it up, and Marsh, reading the Imperial fleet's repositioning on her sensor displays, understood what they were doing within about 40 minutes. She had expected something like this. The encirclement approach was a logical response to the human tendency to push hard and deep. It was, tactically speaking, the correct counter. She had wargamed it with her senior staff on the second day, running simulations of what they would do if the Empire figured out the pattern. They had a response ready. She was not going to let them finish setting up. The third engagement began at 0600 hours on day 5. Marsh did not wait for the Imperial fleet to complete its positioning. She chose the moment when the Imperial formation was half deployed, still shifting into the encirclement posture, and hit them before they were ready. It was not a clean engagement. It was messy and complicated, and 3 of her ships got badly caught trying to press through a gap that closed faster than projected. She lost those 3 ships and their crews, and she would carry that for a long time afterward, but the engagement achieved what she needed it to achieve. The encirclement posture collapsed before it was complete. Voss pulled his ships back again, further this time, buying distance to think and replan. What neither Marsh nor Voss knew was that the engagement had an audience. 2 observer ships from the Galactic Communications Council, the neutral body that administered the common frequencies and trade routes that all species shared, had positioned themselves at the edge of the Sol system. They were there officially to monitor the conflict and ensure that treaty-protected civilian infrastructure was not damaged. In practice, they were watching the battle with the kind of stunned attention that scientists give to something they have never seen before and cannot immediately explain. The observers had watched dozens of wars. They had seen the Empire fight before, had seen the Empire's systematic, methodical, overwhelming approach to conflict and had reached the same conclusion that most of the galaxy had reached, that this was what military dominance looked like, that there was a reason no one challenged the Empire voluntarily. They had never seen anyone fight back like this. The senior observer sent a message to the GCC headquarters that would later be quoted extensively in historical accounts of the war. It was a dry, professional report for the most part, full of technical observations about engagement dynamics and tactical patterns. But at the end, after all the careful analytical language, there was one sentence that did not sound like a bureaucrat at all. It sounded like someone who had just seen something they would not forget. The human fleet is outnumbered approximately 4-1. They are winning. Back on Earth, the war was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Military operations were ongoing, classified at the highest levels, known to the public only in broad strokes. The government was releasing daily updates that were honest in the way that wartime communications are honest, accurate in their facts, and carefully selected in which facts they chose to include. People knew the fighting was hard. They knew ships had been lost. They knew the enemy was powerful. What they also knew, because the mood of a civilization is difficult to hide and impossible to fake, was that the people running the war did not seem panicked. Recruitment offices across Earth and the colonies had been overwhelmed since day one, not with desperate people looking for something to do, with people who had thought about it, talked to their families, made their decisions, and come in ready. Engineers and technicians who worked in the civilian shipyards began volunteering for military production shifts. Medical personnel re-registered for military service. Retired officers came out of retirement, not because anyone asked them to, but because that was what the moment seemed to call for. A species that had been through everything humanity had been through, that had survived all of it and come out the other side with its particular stubbornness intact, did not respond to an existential threat by falling apart. It responded by getting organized. On day 6, something happened that no one had planned for. 3 of the species that existed along the Empire's border, small civilizations that had spent decades being careful and quiet and minding their own business while the Empire did as it pleased, sent formal messages to the United Earth Council. The messages were cautious and hedged with diplomatic language, but their meaning was clear. Humanity was fighting. Humanity was, against all reasonable expectations, holding its own. And the smaller species watching from the edges of the conflict were beginning to ask themselves a question they had not thought to ask in a very long time. What if the Empire could be beaten? They were not offering help. Not yet. They were barely offering sympathy. But they were watching. And the fact that they were watching, the fact that the question was being asked at all, meant something had shifted. Voss read the GCC Observer's report 3 days after it was sent. He read it twice. Then he wrote a message to the War Council that was significantly more direct than anything he had sent before, stripped of the careful professional language, the operational framing, the measured assessments. He told them the truth. He told them this war was not going the way they had planned, and that the reason it was not going that way was not tactical failures or supply problems or any of the things that could be fixed with adjustments and more resources. The reason was the humans themselves. They were not fighting like a species that believed they could lose. They were fighting like a species that considered losing to be, on some fundamental level, simply not one of the available options. He did not know how to plan against that. The Emperor read the message and said nothing for a very long time that on the 9th day of the war, the Empire did something it had not done in 400 years. It asked to talk. The request came through the Galactic Communications Council, routed through the neutral observer ships still positioned at the edge of the Sol system. It was formally worded, as Imperial communications always were, but the content was unmistakable. The Emperor was requesting a cessation of active hostilities and the opening of diplomatic dialogue. He did not use the word ceasefire. Imperial protocol did not have a word for ceasefire that did not carry the implication of imperial generosity extended to a defeated enemy, and that framing no longer fit the situation. So his ministers had spent 2 days carefully constructing language that meant the same thing without meaning that. Marsh received the notification while she was in the middle of a briefing with her senior tactical staff. She read it, set it aside, and finished the briefing. There were operational details that needed attention, damage assessments to review, crew rotation schedules that had been strained past the point of comfortable management. She dealt with all of it. Then she forwarded the request to Earth with a short note that said, "In essence, your call," and went to sleep for 4 hours. She had not slept in 31 hours. The war could wait 4 hours. She was fairly certain it would still be there when she woke up. On Earth, the Secretary General looked at the Imperial request and convened a meeting of the full United Earth Council. The meeting was long and serious and covered the full range of positions available to a deliberative body in an unexpected situation. Some members wanted to reject the request outright and press the military advantage until the Empire conceded everything. Others urged immediate acceptance and a return to the table. Most people were somewhere in the middle, wanting to understand what the Empire was actually offering before deciding anything. The Secretary General listened to all of it. Then she made the decision she had probably already made before the meeting started, because that is how experienced leaders tend to work. They gather input, genuinely, and they weigh it, genuinely, and the weight they give it is real. But the instinct that cuts through to the decision is usually already there, formed quietly in the background while the analytical processes are running. Humanity would talk. It would not stop fighting while it talked, and it would not accept any terms that required it to limit its military capacity or cede territory or acknowledge the Empire's right to have started this war. But it would talk. The response went back through the GCC. The Empire's representative arrived at the neutral station 3 days later. He was a senior diplomat named Counselor Aresh Voth, old and thin and impeccably dressed in the formal layers of imperial courtly clothing, a style of dress that had not changed substantially in 2 centuries because the Empire, as a general cultural matter, preferred continuity to adaptation. He had spent his career navigating the diplomatic currents of 47 star systems, and he was very good at it. He had an excellent read on people and species and the subtle ways that power expressed itself in negotiation. He was not, he admitted privately to his assistant on the journey over, entirely sure what to expect from the humans. His assistant, who was young and had done rather more reading on the subject than Voth had found time for in his preparation, suggested that he go in expecting to be surprised. The human delegation met him at the neutral station. They were led by a diplomat named Elena Vasquez, who was small and precise and had a handshake so firm that it startled Voth slightly, which was a thing that almost never happened to him anymore. She smiled at him without it reaching her eyes, the particular smile of someone who is being professional in a situation where their personal feelings about the other party are not entirely positive, and invited him to sit down. The negotiations took 11 days. Voth was experienced enough to know, within the first session, what the shape of the outcome was going to be. Humanity was not going to fold. They had come to the table from a position of genuine strength, not the pretended strength that parties negotiated from when they were trying to hide weakness, but the calm, settled confidence of people who believed, with reasonable evidence, that they were in the better position. They were not angry at the table. They were not gloating. They were simply there, present and focused, and very clear about what they would and would not accept. What they would not accept: any language acknowledging imperial sovereignty over human territory, any restrictions on UEHM force structure or deployment, any reparations framed as tribute, any agreement that created a formal hierarchy of imperial authority over human decisions, any timeline for demilitarization of any kind. What they would accept: a formal end to hostilities, mutual recognition of territorial boundaries, reopening of trade routes that had been disrupted by the conflict, a framework for dispute resolution that treated both parties as equals under GCC protocols. Voth pushed on several of these points, because that was his job, and because there were members of the War Council who needed to be able to tell themselves that he had fought for something. But the pushes did not move the humans, and after a while Voth stopped pushing, not because he had given up, but because he was a realist, and realists know when a wall is not going to move no matter how hard you lean on it. On the 11th day, they signed an agreement. It was a strange document, historically speaking. It contained none of the usual markers of a post-war settlement, where one party had clearly prevailed over another. There was no formal apology. There was no admission of defeat. There was no list of concessions that read like a catalog of the loser's humiliations. It was, on its face, simply an agreement between 2 parties to stop fighting and establish a framework for future relations. But everyone who read it understood what it meant. The Empire had started a war with humanity expecting swift and total victory. The war had lasted 12 days of active combat. At the end of those 12 days, the Empire had asked to stop fighting. The terms of the settlement gave humanity everything it had held at the start of the conflict and nothing less. No territory lost, no sovereignty compromised, no military capacity reduced. The Empire had swung the full weight of its military might at a species it had never taken seriously, a species its intelligence services had described as emotionally unstable and prone to irrationality. And that species had hit back hard enough that the most powerful empire in the known galaxy had decided it would prefer to negotiate. That was the reality underneath the careful diplomatic language of the settlement document. GCC observers transmitted the text of the agreement to every member species in the network within hours of signing. The three border species that had sent cautious, sympathetic messages to Earth on day 6 sent rather less cautious messages now. Other species began reaching out through official channels and unofficial ones. Trade delegations that had been postponed because of the conflict were rescheduled. A senior representative of a civilization that had been under informal imperial pressure for decades contacted the UEC to ask, with notable directness, whether humanity would be interested in a mutual defense dialogue. The galaxy was recalculating, not because humanity had destroyed the Empire. They hadn't. The Empire was still enormous and still powerful and would remain a dominant force in the galaxy for the foreseeable future. But the calculus of that dominance had changed in a way that could not be changed back. There was now a data point, a real, observed, documented data point, that the Empire could be made to stop, that a determined, prepared, and deeply motivated species could take everything the Empire threw at them and give enough back that the Empire blinked first. Data points like that have a way of spreading. Admiral Marsh was on the bridge of her flagship when the confirmation of the signed agreement came through. She read it on her tablet, nodded once in the way of someone confirming that a thing they expected had in fact occurred, and passed the tablet to her executive officer. He read it and looked up at her. "It's over," he said. "This part," she said. She did not say it with any particular drama. It was just accurate. This engagement was over. The Empire would recalculate and adapt and might try something different at a future point, or might not, depending on how its internal politics evolved and how the new reality of the galaxy settled around them. There would be other challenges, other species, other situations that humanity would need to be ready for. The UEHM would continue building. It would continue training. It would continue the quiet, patient, grinding work of staying ready, because humans had learned a long time ago, in the long and complicated and sometimes very painful history of their species, that readiness was not something you could turn on when you needed it. It was something you maintained always, so that when the moment came, as it always eventually did, you were already there. She had 9 ships to bury, good ships with good people on them, and she would carry those losses with her in the way that commanders carry them, not constantly, but permanently, always present in the background of everything else. She would do that later. She would find the time and the quiet and do it properly. Right now, she had a fleet to put back together. On Earth, in cities and colonies across human space, people came out of their homes and looked up at the sky the way they always did when something large had passed, not in relief exactly, not quite in celebration, but in the particular human way of acknowledging that something had happened and the world was still there. Children who had been too young to understand what the last 12 days meant asked their parents what it was all about, and parents found different ways to explain it, some simple and some complicated, some proud and some just tired. What they had in common, all of those explanations, was a single truth underneath them. Someone had looked at humanity and seen something they thought they could break. They had been wrong. The galaxy, slowly and with the careful deliberation of civilizations that were very old and had learned to be cautious about large conclusions, began to update its understanding of the small, young, strange, stubborn species at the edge of the Orion Arm. The species that had come from one world and spread to dozens. The species that fought amongst itself constantly and still somehow showed up united when something external came for it. The species whose history was a long catalog of terrible things that had been done and survived and occasionally learned from. The species that the most powerful empire in the known galaxy had declared war on, and which had not even flinched.